Heavenly family, we ask your hand of blessing upon this meeting. I pray that you would guide and direct each one of us, and we ask this in the name of the branching sheep. Okay, today is October 21st, 2017, and it is new moon, but this is not the new moon call. This is just the Saturday night call, and Ed and I are going to host tonight, and tonight we decided to discuss something called biases, cognitive biases.
We were going to talk about cognitive biases and a little bit about how they are related to logical fallacies. We have been talking about logical fallacies, and logical fallacies are errors in the way that we're thinking. They're in our logic. So they're in our, actual day-to-day thinking. And cognitive biases are more the mechanics behind our thinking. There are sort of predispositions to thought processes and that kind of thing. They're more like how our brain works. Hey, Mary, can you bring up the Wikipedia page? Because my computer, I don't have anymore.
Yeah. This is, what do you want to know?
Well, I had the definition was on. Okay, so I'm going to read one thing that kind of compares logical fallacies with cognitive bias. So it is important to realize that cognitive bias is different from a logical fallacy. With practice, we can learn to recognize and completely avoid mistakes of logic, which would be a logical fallacy. This is not true of biases. While faults of logic come from how we think, and thus we can simply change our thinking to be more logical, biases arise from the very cognitive machinery that allows us to think. In short, we can't process information without them. This is the definition in Wikipedia. Cognitive biases are tendencies to think in certain ways that can lead to systematic deviations from a standard of rationality or good judgment, and are often studied in psychology and behavioral economics. So anyway, do people have any questions about that at this point? We're going to get into a bunch of examples and that kind of thing, and how it applies to like the medical industry, and a little bit more about how it differs from logical fallacies. But are there any comments yet, or questions, or?
Ed, can I just get you to just repeat what you read, please?
Cognitive biases are tendencies to think in certain ways that can lead to systematic deviations from a standard of rationality or good judgment, and are often studied in psychology and behavioral economics.
If I was going to just explain it, I would just explain it as a way that our mind will operate to make the fastest decision or the easiest decision. And as we go through some of these examples, I think it'll be pretty obvious kind of the difference between a bias and a fallacy, and just how our biases really affect the way we make decisions. And I'm curious about them myself, because again, I'm looking into justification by faith. I want to see how my mind is working, that's causing a problem for me. What ways am I not even aware of that my brain is short-circuiting. And there's another word that kind of is used along with biases, and it's called a heuristic. I've never really heard of a heuristic before, but it's for example, like medical doctors will use this all the time, and it causes biases where they don't have time, really. If you're going in for a doctor appointment, you've only got 15 minutes there or whatever, and they don't really have time to do a careful experiment like Ellen White teaches necessarily on your particular case, and so they're prone to biases when they're making a diagnosis, And I've gone on BDSDA.com, and I've gone to some of the science-based medicine sites to see how these biases affect doctors and how they make diagnoses. And then we can also go through the ways that biases affect our thinking, which I'd rather do first. So me and Ed, we're just going to go through some examples.
Yeah, let's make sure they understand what they are first. But like a bias, like for example, prejudice is a really good one. Like a kid that's brought up in a house where there's a lot of prejudice. Let's say towards another race or something like that. So that person has a bias towards that race of people, right? Now, if that person, they grow up or whatever, and they have this way of thinking that there's something wrong with this whole entire race of people, and then someone asks them to explain why they feel the way they feel, they're going to explain it in a logical way, and that logical way is going to be a fallacy. They're going to explain it with a logical fallacy. Now, their disposition, their prejudice, their mental viewpoint is a bias, but the way that they're going to try to explain it is going to be a fallacy because you can't explain it with truth. You know, it just is false to have prejudice. So it's like their disposition that's built in that they can't get away with. And another way to explain bias, I think the main reason why the brain has these biases within it ultimately is as a protective device. You know, when you're a little kid, you have some natural fears, like you're biased to, like, you know, if you went to the edge of a cliff, you're not going to jump off the cliff, or, you know, you're going to have an understanding as a 2-year-old, and that's a bias towards getting hurt, you know. So your brain is, you know, naturally inclined to protect itself, to protect the human body. And you can't explain it. And also, it's a part of the decision-making that happens very rapid. Like with logical fallacies, there's a thought process that's going on. With biases, there's no real process going on. I'm sorry, there is a process going on, but it's very fast. And it's not in your conscious mind, it's in your processing part of your mind.
Well, let's go through some examples, and then it might become more obvious. One bias is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and I've had this a lot happen to me. The Dunning-Kruger effect bias is that the more you know, the less confident you're likely to be. And this says, because experts know just how much they don't know, they tend to underestimate their ability. But it's easy to be overconfident when you have only a simple idea of how things are. Try not to mistake the cautiousness of experts as a lack of understanding, nor give too much credence to lay people who appear confident but have only superficial knowledge. And I would say that this has affected me and probably all of us. Like we really, you know, we've been in this message for a while, and really we know a lot. We understand probably the Bible on a level that most lay people don't. But sometimes I feel like the more I know, the less I feel less confident. You know, I feel like I don't know anything. Sometimes I feel like I know less than I did a few years ago. And that's obviously not true. You know, that's just an error in my thinking. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that. Basically, you know, the more you know you don't know. But it also causes this feeling that you really don't know anything. I don't know if any of you have ever had that. Here's another bias. This one, you'll like this one too. It's called the curse of knowledge, that once you understand something, you presume it to be obvious to everyone. It says things make sense once they make sense, so it can be hard to remember when and why they didn't. We build complex networks of understanding and forget how intricate the path to our available knowledge really is. This bias is closely related to the hindsight bias, wherein you will tend to believe that an event was predictable all along once it has occurred. We have difficulty reconstructing our own prior mental states of confusion and ignorance once we have clear knowledge. And I think we get into this trouble a little bit with purity zones, where something may be very obvious to us, but wouldn't have been obvious to us 2 or 3 years ago. And sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that everybody knows this, and everybody doesn't know this.
It's kind of like, you know, as we learn this message and we start to understand it, and, you know, we get used to talking about it, and we tend to forget sometimes when someone's just starting out that they might not understand all of it yet, and we fail to really come down to their level sometimes, because we've just been, I don't want to say advanced, but yeah, I guess I could say advanced. But have you ever done that where you've neglected to realize, oh, this person's still, not understanding this part, so I need to get, more down to their level, that kind of thing, right?
Totally, right. Mm-hmm.
All right, so another bias is called the self-serving bias. And the self-serving bias is how social psychologists describe humans' tendency to blame external forces when bad things happen and give ourselves credit when good things happen. And this is kind of like a self-defense mechanism, help us to deal with some of the things that happen to us in life. Says, although it can mean evading personal responsibility for one's actions, self-serving bias is a defense mechanism that protects a person's self-esteem. And examples of this would be, let's say that you ace an exam. The self-serving bias would lead you to believe that it's because you studied hard. If you failed the exam, on the other hand, you might believe it was because the teacher didn't explain the subject correctly, the classroom was too warm, or your roommate kept you up all night before the exam. So obviously things like that can be true, but it's, your mind is going to automatically take you to these places. And one thing, too, to just real quick talk about the difference between, because you could classify a lot, there's like a close relationship between these biases and logical fallacies. In previous calls, I can remember Trent talking about the brain basically being a computer. And as a computer, it's processing information, and the brain, as it's developing when we're a child, it picks up on little subroutines and just builds them into the brain to save on time and to be able to make really quick decisions. And these biases are almost always part of that quick decision making. It's these subroutines that are happening in our brain to be able to process different things that we see or different inputs to the brain very rapidly. And those are those biases. So it's not where there's a lot of cognitive thinking going on. So the logical fallacies are in our thinking part of the brain. Biases are in just the automated part of our process. So anyway, is there any comments on the self-serving bias? Do you want to move on to another one, or should I do it?
Yeah, I have another one. It's called the Just World Hypothesis, that your preference for justice makes you presume it exists. This description is a world in which people don't always get what they deserve, hard work doesn't always pay off, and injustice happens is an uncomfortable one that threatens our preferred narrative. However, it is also the reality. This bias is often manifest in ideas such as what goes around comes around, or like karma, or these kind of things, and can lead to blaming victims of crimes and circumstance, like, well, you kind of deserved it kind of thing. I can think of King David in one of the Psalms, off the top of my head, where he just asked, why do the wicked prosper? It doesn't seem like that's karma. It seems like David is recognizing that sometimes wicked people do prosper, And this is an interesting bias, because I can also think of scriptures where the Bible says, what measure you meet will be meted you, which is kind of what goes around comes around idea as well. So I can see kind of both realities kind of presented in the Bible, but I thought that was an interesting one. Basically, you're biased that justice will occur. Well, it doesn't always work that way. Like Trent says that, tragedy is a real thing, and sometimes bad things do happen to good people.
Sorry, any comments on that one? I have kind of a fun one here. It's called functional fixedness. Functional fixedness is a type of cognitive bias that involves a tendency to see an object is only working in a particular way. For example, you might view a thumbtack as something that can only be used to hold paper to a corkboard, but what other uses might it have? In many cases, functional fixedness can prevent people from seeing the full range of uses for an object. It can also impair our ability to think of novel solutions to problems. So just for fun, I'm going to kind of present a little scenario here, and then you guys could try to come up with the answer. And basically, I've kind of given it away already because we've talked about the thumbtacks, but this is the scenario. We have 2 candles, numerous thumbtacks, and a box of matches. Using only these items, try to figure out how to mount the candles to a wall. And I'll say that again. So you have 2 candles, numerous thumbtacks, a box of matches. Using only these items, try to figure out a way to mount the candles to a wall. So does anybody have any ideas?
I have an idea.
Okay.
So if it's a box of matches, you could tack the box, you could empty the box of the matches and tack the box to the wall and set the candles like in the opening of the box. That's one way. Or you could even use the matches to brace around the bases of the candles as added support, that sort of thing.
Yep, that's actually very good. That's like the solution that they gave for it was to actually melt the candles, the base of the candle, drip a little bit of wax onto the box and stick the candles to the box that way. And then actually exactly what you said, mount the box to the wall with the thumbtacks. So that was a solution. But, what they said in this is most people can't get away from the trying to use the thumbtack somehow in the candles. They're trying to stick the thumbtack through the wick or whatever. Because they can only see sticking the thumbtack in the wall, it blocks their imagination to all of the other parts of the, of the scenario. So anyway, yeah, you nailed it. That was good.
Here's another one called reactance, which you would rather do the opposite of what someone is trying to make you do. When we feel our liberty is being constrained, our inclination is to resist. However, in doing so, we can overcompensate. While blind conformity is far from an ideal way to approach things, neither is being a knee-jerk contrarian. And I think of that bias as so interesting. We actually experienced it today while walking our dog. But that, when we find out that the law is outside of God, it's not like the 10 Commandments are necessarily even made up by God, but they're just true, and that they exist for all of us, even for God. That takes away this whole bias of reactance, where it's not like God is telling us, hey, you better follow these 10 little rules or else you're not in my kingdom. It's sort of like, no, seriously, I want you to live, and you must, realize that this is the truth. If you want to live eternally, this is the way. And it's not even like they're, you know what I'm saying, as opposed to saying, do not do this or do not do that. Any parent knows that, if you don't like your daughter's boyfriend, the worst thing you can do is tell her, I don't like him, because then sometimes, and I'm not saying this happened with my kids necessarily, but they'll be more inclined to go with him just because you don't want them to. We took our dog for a walk today without a leash, and we've recently noticed he's actually much better without a leash because he's free to follow us, instead of like pulling him on a leash. It's just if you had a dash sound, I think you would understand. But we were just laughing about that today, like how a leash is constraining and how in freedom he really does want to follow us when he's free to do that. So I thought that was an interesting bias, which is we have a tendency to do the opposite of what someone is trying to make us do. And again, a bias would be just a quick, natural reaction. It's not necessarily a well thought out response, but just maybe our quick first response to something. Any comments on that one?
Oh, I don't have any comments on that one.
I actually remember one time back in our Protestant life, we had a pastor who was talking basically exactly about this, that, God loves, this is on the issue of tithing, what is God loves a free giver,
a cheerful giver.
And on that top, he was like basically saying, and he'd seen evidence of this through the years, that if you just tell people to do whatever they want, they actually give more than if they are, held fast to this rule or whatever. And, I don't know that his doctrine was very good there, but it was an effect that he actually saw. The giving went up when he didn't tell people give 10%, just give whatever you want to give. So anyway.
Not that we're promoting that.
Yeah, not promoting that. Go ahead.
Okay. This one is another one I was thinking about this week. It's called the spotlight effect, where you overestimate how much people notice how you look and act. Most people are much more concerned about themselves than they are about you. Absent over prejudices, people generally want to like and get along with you as it gives them validation to. It's healthy to remember that although we're the main character in our own story of life, everyone else is the center stage in their life too. And we were talking about this even with our Sabbath dress, where you're supposed to have a Sabbath suit, where you're wearing the same thing every Sabbath. And I think you had mentioned, Teresa, that, the truth is most people aren't even going to notice. Like people don't really, I wonder what everyone's wearing. No one's really looking at that. And so it's a bigger thing to us. Like we think everyone's looking at every single thing we do. And, in some respects, they're looking at our righteousness for sure and our light, but are they really looking at the color of our eyes or what color our glasses are or what color my skirt is? And would they even notice? No, they're probably not going to. So.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Or a good example, I should say.
This one kind of relates to some that Mary already gave. It's called the optimism bias. And basically it's that by definition we can't all be above average, but we generally think that way. Like they went on to a college campus and they interviewed students and asked them, do you see yourself as potentially ever getting a divorce, for example? And nobody ever said that. Or do you see yourself above average on salary or below average on salary when you get out of college? Everybody was above average. And do you see yourself as more intelligent or less intelligent? And of course, everybody's more intelligent, and obviously half of them are going to be, just by definition, 50% of them are going to make less than an average salary, and 50% of them are less than average intelligence, and so on. So, but yeah, that's a bias that we just naturally have. Again, probably for self-preservation reasons and so on, and self-esteem.
There's another one called belief bias. So if a conclusion supports your existing beliefs, you'll rationalize anything that supports it. And it says it's difficult for us to set aside our existing beliefs to consider the true merits of an argument. In practice, this means that our ideas become impervious to criticism and are perpetually reinforced. Instead of thinking about our beliefs in terms of true or false, it's probably better to think of them in terms of probability. Obviously, I think this happens all the time, like especially in politics. If someone's a Republican or Democrat, they're very biased to whatever their candidate decides, even if it goes against their, what they think is right or wrong. They're biased towards what that politician is going to say or do, and they'll start to be biased towards what that candidate will say because they like that candidate, or it supports their existing beliefs. Even like the idea of like the Trinity or an immaterial God. It's amazing the things that we can do to rationalize that, because that's what we believe. That's what we've believed in the past. So we really have a bias towards that, and just can't think rationally past that. Any comments on that one?
Just that's a big one.
This is another one. It's called the sunk cost fallacy, that you irrationally cling to things that have already cost you something. So once you've invested like your time or your money, or even if you've publicly proclaimed something, then it's really hard to let it go because you've invested so much in it already. So this aversion to pain or our pride can distort our better judgment and cause us to make unwise investments, or to hold on to an investment that's failing, or to hold on, to a business maybe that you have that's failing because you've put so much time into it, so much energy, so much money. When you should jump ship, you hold on to it because it's cost you so much. And can anyone think of anything, I guess in the realm of faith or in the realm of this message with the sunk cost fallacy?
With that one, I was thinking, what came to mind was, there's so many usurpers or, people claiming in leaders, right, in different factions of the messages, whether it's Branch, Davidia, SDA. And we've talked about this before, where that's one thing that they would have a hard time letting go, right? If they've seen the true movement, or they've come across a true movement, and let's say they're, leading out a following. Well, they spent so much time and investment, right? And given people perhaps false information, now they got to back out of it, right? That would be a tough thing, and I could see how this relates to that situation.
For sure. I was even looking at some other examples on that, and it was saying actually manipulatively if you want someone to believe what you're saying, to make them publicly proclaim it. And that if you don't want them, the last thing you want is for someone to make a public proclamation of something that you don't necessarily believe is true. Because once you do that public proclamation, it's really hard to back off of that. And I would say the same thing if you've invested a lot of money in something too. It's really hard to let go because you feel like, spend all that money on that, or whatever. And yeah, but for sure, I could see where that's a huge problem if you're in the leadership of a movement or of anything really. It's really hard to back off of that.
And another thing that came to mind too, right? Personal experience when Michael got disfellowshipped, and he looked up in the church manual where they went wrong and how they did it unjustly, right? So he actually took a trip to Ottawa, Ontario, and met with a conference leader, like some guy, I can't remember what his position was, but anyways, one of the higher up guys, and explained to him, what had happened. And he agreed. He agreed with Michael that it was unjustly, his membership was unjustly taken away. And he admitted that, and he decided to give Michael back. He says, I'll give you back your membership, right? And Michael says, well, public error or public sin requires public confession. He insisted on that. And he was okay in giving him his membership back, but to actually get the church to make it a public confession was not in agreement. He couldn't do it. So Michael says, then I don't want my membership back, or it's okay, right? So that's right. Another thing I thought of.
Yeah, that's a good example. Really good.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that Ellen White has a statement that people are deceived by their own thoughts, and that's exactly what I think that relates to. Says
right, that's good.
Right. And so I'm thinking that. And also I was thinking about sometimes in the past when people write books and they write on a certain topic, then later on they may find out that the book didn't have all the correct information. Then what do they do, right?
Right. Actually, I wrote a whole study on the Wednesday crucifixion. Right. I thought for sure, oh man, Jesus was crucified on Wednesday. I wrote up this whole thing and I was promoting it to people, and then I read like the Sign of Jonah, and I was like, oh, wow, like I was like so wrong. I'm not stupid. I mean, I bowed to the Heavenly Sister, ripped my paper up, and I was like, you are the queen, and the spirit of prophecy rules, and I was wrong. But it was hard. I've had to swallow so much crow on so many things that my private interpretation has taken me to really bad places, and especially where I've made public, grandstanding on various things. So, yeah, that's a hard one. But yeah, when you're, I could see when I was completely wrong on the Wednesday crucifixion. I just couldn't even believe it when I saw it. But it is really cool. The good thing is that I can see that this message is absolutely true, and the spirit of prophecy just answers questions in a pretty ironclad way. And I would rather be led by the truth than by my own mind any day. So anyway.
Okay, so another one is called understanding confirmation bias, and this one's pretty interesting. A confirmation bias is a type of cognitive bias that involves favoring information which confirms previously existing beliefs or biases. And you can just see how the brain, if it just already lines up with what you previously thought, you're just going to pass it off without thinking. It's just a shortcut for the brain. An example of this would be, imagine that a person holds a belief that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. Whenever this person encounters a person that is both left-handed and creative, they place greater importance on this evidence that supports what they've already believed. This individual might even seek proof that further backups of this belief while discounting examples that do not support the idea. And that's, it's a dangerous one, especially if our preconceived notion is wrong.
Here's another one I think is big in this message, is called the bystander effect, where you presume that someone else is going to do something in an emergency situation, or I would say that you presume someone else is going to do something, period, in any situation. Like, if, you're not the one, it's going to be somebody else, and someone else is going to take care of this, But this particular bias is, in an emergency situation. The example is when something terrible is happening in a public setting, we can experience a kind of shock and mental paralysis that distracts us from a sense of personal responsibility. The problem is that everyone can experience this sense of de-individualization in a crowd. This same sense of losing our sense of self in a crowd has been likened to violent and antisocial behaviors. Remaining self-aware requires some amount of effortful reflection in group situations. But I would say, just as an example in this message, sometimes, we might be bystanders to Trent, for example, and think that he's gonna do everything and tell us what to do, and I know that he does not want us to do that. He wants us all to get involved and start doing things. And but this is a common bias that we have, that someone else is going to, and it can paralyze us, paralyze the movement, really, too.
So another one is called the misinformation effect, or bias. The misinformation effect bias refers to the tendency for post-event information to interfere with the memory of the original event. And Trent's talked about this in the past, actually. Researchers have shown that the introduction of even relatively subtle information following an event can have a dramatic effect on how people remember. The misinformation effect can lead to inaccurate memories, and in some cases even results in formation of false memories. The misinformation effect illustrates how easily memories can be influenced and raises concerns about the reliability of memory, particularly in the case of eyewitness memories used to determine criminal guilt. And Trent's talked quite a bit about this one. Are there any comments on that?
Here's another interesting one. It's called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, where basically our brains are really good at detecting patterns, and so we find sometimes close repeated occurrences. We think of it as, let me just read it here. It says, you may have heard about the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon before. In fact, you probably learned about it for the first time quite recently. This is a joke, actually. If not, then you might hear about it again very soon. The Bader-Meinhof is the phenomenon where one stumbles upon some obscure piece of information and then soon afterwards encounters the same subject again, often repeatedly. Anytime the phrase, that's so weird, I just heard about that yesterday, would be appropriate in this Bader-Meinhof example. So some people seem to have experienced the phenomenon at least a few times in their lives, and many people encounter it with such regularity that they anticipated upon the introduction of some new information, and they're just asking what the underlying cause of it is. But sometimes, like if you just get a new car that's white, whatever model and make it is, then everyone all of a sudden seems to have that car, and like last week you never really noticed it before. But that our brain is definitely prejudiced towards patterns, and sometimes this bias and this phenomenon can cause us to, I think more greatly of things than they really are. Let's see. I feel like this happens to me a lot, where I make basically the logical fallacy of putting too much, I give too much credence to some type of coincidence, that maybe God is speaking to me because I just heard the name Bernadette yesterday, and now this person's name is Bernadette, and so Bernadette must be someone in my life that I need to whatever. I'm making that up totally, but I've done that before, where just these, but not really realizing that my brain is just really good at recognizing patterns, and if the word Bernadette comes to my mind and it's an unusual word, then I'm going to be more inclined to notice the word Bernadette the next time it comes up, where if I didn't just hear that word yesterday, I would never have noticed Bernadette and wouldn't have thought it was some kind of divine appointment or anything like that. But I've fell victim to that phenomenon many times. I don't know if anyone else has, or could give an example of it.
Being aware of all these brain biases, such that we are aware of them and then we're defensive and trying to remain unbiased, it almost seems impossible to be truly unbiased. Even when you think you're unbiased, you're still biased.
I think that's right. To some extent, like we need to, I think we could fight it, but I don't know that we could conquer it, because it's, the brain is just automatically trying to find these shortcuts, and a lot of them are protective measures for our self-esteem or our physical, safety. But yeah, you're right. And I think, most of our problems are in the logical fallacy area, So I think it's good to be aware of these biases, but the more important thing is logical fallacies, because they're in our conscious thinking. They're not these like subroutines that are going on in the background. So I think it's good to be aware of cognitive biases, but the more important thing is to, we know that we can conquer logical fallacies by understanding them and being aware of them and understanding the problems that are caused by them.
I think too. Here's another one. We talked about the optimism bias, but there's also a pessimism bias or a negativity bias, where you overestimate the likelihood of something negative. And it can be a bias. I think, for example, I think I have both kind of biases, where sometimes I'm like if I'm witnessing to somebody and they show any interest at all, I just think they're totally going to get this, and, I go off, into an unrealistic expectation optimistically, although I know Ellen White said Jesus expected much, so he attempted much. So I do try to be mostly optimistic in my expectations, but I don't want to be really unrealistic. In this message, I've realized that I've been way more optimistic, I think, in general. But there's also the opposite one, which is a pessimism bias, in which we might be inclined to overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes, like, it's hard when someone leaves the message or whatever. Even if we, trip and fall or whatever, we might just be inclined to be pessimistically biased as well. I mean, I think we're probably either more optimistic or more pessimistic, but both, I think, are biases that we just need to be aware of, that we might be likely to slant one way or the other.
I think we're all guilty of especially the pessimism bias. I mean, that's like the guy in the grocery store that's in front of you, and you're thinking, should I witness to that guy? He's not going to get it. There's no way, So, I mean, that one holds us from witnessing probably more than anything else. Fear of, some kind of bad, reaction from the person or whatever. Pessimistic viewpoint.
Any comments on that one?
All right, so another one is the false consensus effect. And I think some of these are starting to overlap with each other a bit, but that's okay. The false consensus effect, the tendency to overestimate how much other people agree with us, is known among social psychologists as the false consensus effect. This kind of cognitive bias leads people to believe that their own values and ideas are normal and that the majority of people share these same opinions. Here's an example. Let's say Jim's Facebook newsfeed is full of stories advocating a certain political position. Even though that feed is curated by Jim to include people he knows and is influenced by an algorithm based on Jim's behavior, he may overestimate how many people agree with his position.
We could finish up here. We just have a few more. Here's another bias called the halo effect, which is how much you like someone or how attractive they are influences your judgment of them. And I think about this a little bit with the logical fallacy of appeal to authority, or even bandwagon a little bit, but it's a little bit different because it's, basically that we're biased towards how people look and how much we like them, and that influences, or the opposite. If we don't like the way they look or don't like them, we tend not to give credence to what they're saying. It says our judgments are associative and automatic, and so if we want to be objective, we need to consciously control for irrelevant influences. This is especially important in a professional setting. Things like attractiveness can unduly influence issues as important as a jury deciding someone's guilt or innocence. If someone is successful or fails in one area, this can also unfairly color our expectations of them in another area. So it's funny, like I used to work at Brooks Brothers, which is a store that sells suits and ties, actually. It's before I was in the message. And, we had these sales goals where we had to sell a certain amount of dollars each day, And so, and there were a number of us in the store, a number of the salespeople, and so someone would walk in the front door and we would automatically size them up, if they were wearing a suit, okay, or if they came in, in jeans and a T-shirt, well, what are they doing in Brooks Brothers, And so, we had learned, do not do that. Do not judge the guy in the T-shirt and the jeans, because sometimes that can be, you could sell them $2,000 or $3,000 worth of clothes. And actually, I'll tell you what we really did find is the guy that came in the suit never bought anything, but it was opposite of what you would have thought, actually. But I'm sure that's true even in this message to some degree. And of course, we want to be presentable and as clean cut as we can be. But unfortunately, people do judge by appearances. Do you have any more?
That's all I have.
Okay. Well, does anyone have any other general questions or comments about biases?
I think they're all very broad and very interesting. It's hard to, in a short time, to really dive into the different different biases to really get a good feel for them, you know.
Oh yeah. This is just an introduction, and yes, it's definitely an overview.
I was gonna, just to kind of wrap things up, I found a couple things I thought would be good to read, and then we can go ahead and just wrap things up. But the first one was, how do cognitive biases work? And then the second thing was, what causes cognitive biases? So I'm just going to read these real quick. How do cognitive biases work? When we are making judgments and decisions about the world around us, we like to think that we are objective, logical, and capable of thinking in and evaluating all the information that is available to us. The reality is, however, that our judgments and decisions are often riddled with errors and influenced by a wide variety of biases. The human brain is both remarkable and powerful, but certainly subject to limitations. Cognitive biases are just one type of fundamental limitation on human thinking. A cognitive bias is a type of error in thinking that occurs when people are processing and interpreting information in the world around them. Cognitive biases are often a result of our attempt to simplify information processing. They are rules of thumb that help us to sense the world and reach decisions with relative speed. And obviously, unfortunately, sometimes these biases trip us up, leading to poor decisions and bad judgments. And then on the cause of them, if you had to think about every possible option when making a decision, it would probably take a lot of time to even make the simplest choice. Because of the sheer complexity of the world around us and the amount of information in the environment, it is necessary sometimes to rely on some mental shortcuts that allow us to act quickly. Cognitive biases can be caused by a number of different things, but it is these mental shortcuts that often play a major contributing role. The mental shortcuts are known as heuristics, and while they can often be surprisingly accurate, they can also lead to errors in thinking. Social pressures, individual motivations, emotions, and limits on the mind's ability to process information can also contribute to these biases. These biases are not necessarily all bad, however. Psychologists believe that many of these biases serve an adaptive purpose. They allow us to reach decisions quickly. This can be vital if we are facing a dangerous or threatening situation. If you're walking down a dark alley and spot a dark shadow that seems to be following you, a cognitive bias might lead you to assume that it is a mugger and that you need to exit the alley as quickly as possible. The dark shadow may have simply been caused by a flag waving in the breeze, but relying on mental shortcuts can often get you out of the way of danger in situations where decisions need to be made quickly. So anyway, I just thought that kind of helped a little bit to explain the biases. So
yeah,
is there any other comments?
Just that I really enjoyed the overview tonight.
Yeah, thank you. So would anybody like to close us off in prayer?
I'll be happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Heavenly Family, thank you for just the direction that you're taking us in to teach us how to think and how to reason and how to recognize if and when we aren't thinking or reasoning properly. Help us to really be able to grasp the lessons, and in so doing, I pray that this will enable us to really reach the rest of the world in the best way possible. So we thank you. Thank you for the Sabbath. Thank you for the new moon that we are in now, and we ask for you to guide us with truth that we can feed upon during our meeting tomorrow. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen. Well, Lila Tov, everyone.
Amen.
Happy New Moon.
Happy New Moon. Lila Tov.
Night.
Good night.